Hello again, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Deep in the Bible podcast. Our aim is to help you grow in your knowledge of God's truth by getting deep in the Bible. I'm your host, Timothy Agee, and I have been a preacher and a teacher of God's Word for over 30 years. In today's lesson, we begin a new series called We Know, which will be a study of the epistle of 1 John. This first episode will be an introduction to this great letter. So if you're ready to get started, grab your copy of God's Word, roll up your sleeves, and let's get deep in the Bible together. A quick reminder that this podcast is available in video format on YouTube and in audio format on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any of your preferred podcasting platforms. If you are watching this on YouTube, please hit the subscribe button below and give this video a thumbs up. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other platform, please follow our podcast so you will be notified as new episodes are made available. Now, with that out of the way, let's get to the lesson. All right, so today we begin a new study on the epistle of 1 John, and we're calling this new series We Know, which is a phrase that comes directly from the text and also points to one of the main themes of this letter, which is what it truly means to know God, or what it truly means to have a relationship with God. For this series, there will be study guides, and those study guides are out on our website, deepinthebible.com. From there, click on study guides, and you can access the study guides for the lessons. And this first lesson is going to be an introduction where I largely focus on the occasion for this letter, which helps us understand the greater context in which it was written, and also will ultimately help us in interpreting John's teachings in this letter. And if you've got the study guide for the introduction, I'm just going to work my way through the main topics that are in there. And the first topic is who is the author of this letter. Now, it's called 1 John, and so there is an assumption that this was written by John, specifically the Apostle John. However, the author does not identify himself within the letter. So even though it's likely, as I think, it's almost certain that this letter was written by the Apostle John, how did we arrive at that if the author does not identify himself? A few things about the Apostle John that will help us in our identification of him as the author. Number one, that the Apostle John is mentioned in the Gospels as being a son of Zebedee, along with his brother James, who both were called to be disciples of Jesus. For example, Mark chapter 1, verses 19 and 20. Going on a little farther, he saw James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, who were in the boat mending the nets. And immediately he called them, and they left their father Zebedee. So James and John, both disciples of Jesus, both sons of Zebedee. John, the Apostle John, was also one of Jesus's inner circle, one of his closest friends. And as an example, when Jesus went up on the mount to be transfigured, he took 3 of his disciples with him, Peter, James, and John, because John, again, we infer from the Gospels that John was one of his closest friends. And with that in mind, in John's Gospel, you have the synoptic Gospels, the Gospels that cover similar events, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And then you have John's Gospel written by the Apostle John, which is a little bit different, focuses on different things. And John refers to himself in his Gospel as the disciple that Jesus loved. So there was a close relationship there, and we'll get to more of that in just a minute. Now, thinking about why do we believe that the Apostle John, the son of Zebedee, one of Jesus' inner circle, the disciple that Jesus loved, why do we think he's the one that wrote this letter? Well, the first thing that I have in the study guide is that some of the earliest Christian writers, or many of them, identified John as the author of this letter. For example, Irenaeus, Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, and Origen, all from the 2nd and 3rd century AD, they all identified John as being the author of this gospel. But that's not the only reason. There's also a lot of internal evidence in the text that points to the Apostle John being the author. And I've got, I think, 5 reasons in the study guide listed, internal evidences that John is the author. Number 1, the style of writing is very similar between the Gospel of John and the letter that we call First John. The style of writing is very, very similar. Number 2, there are also many similar phrases and expressions between the Gospel of John and the letter of First John. Now, in the study guide, I have a grid that has a lot of comparisons. I'm not going to go through many of those because we will, Lord willing, hit all of those in our verse-by-verse study of this letter. But just as an example, 1 John chapter 1, verse 1, John begins with, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked upon and have touched with our hands concerning the word of life." And then you look at the way the Gospel of John begins. It starts with, "In the beginning," John 1:1, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." Going down a few verses to verse 14, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen His glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Both the Gospel of John and the letter that we call First John begin in a similar way, talking about the Word, describing Jesus as the Word, talking about how He came to earth, became man, emphasizing those things. And then the last example that I have in the grid, 1 John chapter 5, verse 12, Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son of God does not have life." And in John chapter 3, verse 36, "Whoever believes in the Son has eternal life. Whoever does not obey the Son shall not see life, but the wrath of God remains on him." And again, just 2 examples of the similar expressions and phrases between the Gospel of John and the letter that we call First John. Also, in the letter of First John, there is a great emphasis on eyewitness testimony. That this was written by someone who was consistently in the presence of Jesus. The very beginning of the letter, as I just referenced, talks about that this one who is described as the Word of life, Jesus. He says, "We have heard, we have seen, we've looked upon, we've touched with our hands." This is someone written by someone who was in close proximity to Jesus for presumably a long period of time. The fourth kind of internal evidence that this was written by someone with a sense of authority, one who is writing with commands, with assertions, and is not afraid to point out the error of his opponents. Again, written with the air of authority, like one who was an apostle of Jesus Christ. For example, 1 John chapter 2, verse 15, "Do not love the world or the things in the world." Chapter 2, verse 24, "Let what you heard from the beginning abide in you." Again, written with the air of authority. Assertions like 1 John chapter 2, verse 6, "Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked." And then identification of error. 1 John chapter 1, verse 6, "If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth." Chapter 2, verse 4, "Whoever says, 'I know him,' but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him." So again, written by someone who had the authority of Jesus, who was able to give commands, assertions, and point out the errors of his opponents. And then the fifth kind of internal evidence, beyond just being an eyewitness, this is written by one who gives the impression that they had a close relationship with Jesus. Again, going back to the beginning of this letter, talking about, that which was from the beginning, which is the word of life. We have heard, we have seen, we have looked upon, we have touched with our hands. Again, a description that would come from one who had a close relationship, a close relationship with Jesus. And John would clearly fit that, being the disciple that Jesus loved, one of Jesus's inner circle. And so those kind of 5 internal evidences that lead us to conclude that the Apostle John was the author of this letter. All right, let's move on from talking about the author of this letter to the thing that I mostly want to focus on in this introduction, and that is the occasion for this writing. And if you look in the study guide, I've got written down occasion Gnosticism. And the occasion from this letter, I believe, is to defend the true gospel message against an early form of what would later become known as Gnosticism. When I say later, by the 2nd century, we'll talk about the timing of the writing of this letter in just a minute. But I believe that John is writing to defend the gospel message against, again, as I just said, what will later become known as Gnosticism, a type of false teaching. How do I conclude that, or how do we know that? Well, a couple of things. One is from historically what we know about Gnosticism, what we know about those who identified themselves as Gnostics and what they believed. And then with that, looking at what John is writing in this letter, and you can see kind of point by point that John is addressing the claims of the Gnostics. Again, John is addressing some of the early teachings that would later become known as Gnosticism. And there's, in the study guide, I have got kind of 5 kind of characteristics or 5 claims of the Gnostics. And the first of these, which is the central tenet of what would later become known as Gnosticism, is referred to as dualism. And it's this idea that everything in spirit is good and everything in body is evil. And body and spirit never intersect. They never cross each other, okay? Flesh and spirit do not intersect. And all of the teachings, the next 4 things that we will look at, come from that central tenet of this false teaching, okay? The second thing that I have listed there is that to the Gnostics, salvation was an escape from the body by way of a special type of knowledge. Gnosticism comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means to know, and the Gnostics believed that they had a special knowledge that would lead them to be able to escape the body and lead them to salvation. And that's why there is such an emphasis in this letter about what true godly knowledge is all about. And one of the things that we will look at when we go through this letter is all the times that John says the phrase that I'm using to refer to this series, which is "we know." For example, 1 John chapter 2, verse 3, "And by this we know we have come to know him if we keep his commandments." 1 John chapter 3, verse 16, "By this we know love, that he laid down his life for us." 1 John chapter 5, verse 2, "By this we know that we love the children of God, when we love God and obey his commandments." Okay? So over and over and over again, John directly addressing the Gnostic claim of this special knowledge that is given to a select few, and countering that with what true knowledge of God is all about. And the third teaching that I have listed there in the study guide that comes from the central tenet of dualism, where spirit and body never intersect, where spirit is good and body is evil, is that the Gnostics would deny that Jesus came in the flesh, because they would say one who is a spiritual being could not be manifested in the flesh, which again is in direct contradiction of the message of the gospel. And it's one of the reasons I believe that John greatly emphasizes the humanity of Jesus, the fact that Jesus was manifested on this earth. From the very beginning, John says, in chapter 1, verse 1, we have heard, we have seen, we have looked upon with our eyes, we have touched with our hands, emphasizing that Jesus not only came in the flesh, but we saw him, we heard him, we touched him. Chapter 2, verse 22, who is the liar but the one, he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. Chapter 4, verses 2 and 3, by this you know the Spirit of God. Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is from God, and every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. Okay, so again, denying that Jesus came in the flesh, denying one of the central tenets of the gospel of Jesus. And then the fourth teaching that comes from Gnosticism that I have listed there, that since the body was considered to be evil, that oftentimes Gnostics would practice what is called asceticism, which is harm to the body. Can be something like fasting or depriving yourself from food and drink, all the way to actually beating yourself, causing physical harm to the body. And while John's letter does not specifically address this concept of asceticism, there are other writings in the New Testament that deal with this. For example, the Colossian letter written by Paul, Colossians chapter 2, verse 23, says, these have indeed an appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion and asceticism, severity to the body, but they are of no value in stopping the indulgence of the flesh. And then the fifth teaching, which does play a big role in the letter of 1 John, the fifth teaching that came from Gnosticism was, again, back to this idea of dualism, that spirit is good, body is evil, and the two do not intersect. That because they do not intersect, that one can live in the body however they want to, and it will not impact the spirit. You can live out your carnal desires. You can live out your sinful nature. And that is why John, from the very beginning of this letter, greatly emphasizes that the way we live does matter. For example, 1 John chapter 1, verse 5 says, this is the message we have heard from him and proclaim to you, that God is light, and in him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with him while we walk in darkness, we lie and do not practice the truth. 1 John chapter 2, verse 3, by this we know that we have come to know him if we keep his commandments. Whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. So over and over and over in this letter, John will emphasize what it truly means to know God, and that knowing God is equated to doing what God has asked us to do, not indulging the sinful nature, not living out our carnal desires, that is not consistent with one who knows God. And so again, all of that coming from this concept of dualism. Spirit is good, body is evil. The two never intersect. And from that, the Gnostics taught that Jesus did not come in the flesh. Jesus was not manifested on this earth. That you could live however you want to live. You can indulge your sinful nature. And so John, throughout this letter, will consistently be refuting the teachings of these early Gnostics who claim to have this special knowledge of how to escape the body. And John's going to talk about what true knowledge of God is all about. It's not mystical. It is the gospel of Jesus Christ. All right, as we continue to move down the study guide for the introduction, let's talk about the recipients of this letter. Just like John does not identify himself as the author of the letter, he also does not specifically identify a group of recipients. One of the things that we know, however, about these recipients is that they were believers in Jesus Christ. For example, 1 John chapter 3, verse 1, see what kind of love the Father has given us that we should be called children of God. So again, writing this to believers, however, there is not a specific group that is identified, not a specific local church that is identified. Maybe this was written to a single local body of the church, or maybe it was intended as a circular letter to be passed along to numerous local bodies of Christ around the known world at that time. But specific recipients are not identified. We simply know that they are believers. And then the final thing that I have in the introduction, in the study guide, is the date of the writing. And again, it's difficult to pinpoint a specific date because there are no external references. Again, no specific references to recipients. However, one of the things we can pull from this, and we've already talked about this a little bit, is that it is clear, I believe, that the letter of 1 John builds upon the concepts of what was written in the Gospel of John. Now, there are many who identify that the Gospel of John was written later in the first century AD, the last of the Gospels to be written. And there are many who will point to an approximate date of writing of the Gospel of John to around 85 AD, somewhere in that vicinity. And so if this letter were written after the Gospel of John, that would put it after 85 AD. So again, later first century, maybe between 85 and 95 AD, probably near the end of John's life. And that is, again, the approximate date of this writing, but not that that's terribly relevant. The most important thing, I believe, from this introduction is understanding the occasion, because that sets the context. And where John is going to key off this idea from these false teachers, of this false teaching that will later, the next century, be known as Gnosticism, and that this idea of claiming this special knowledge, that John writes this letter to say, no, let me talk to you about what real godly knowledge is all about. What does it really mean to know God? And as we go through this letter, week after week, and we go through this verse by verse, there's a couple of things that I will make sure to point out. One is I will point out the parallels and the comparisons between the Gospel of John and the letter of 1 John. But the other thing is that when John is directly refuting one of those core teachings of what would later become known as Gnosticism, we will talk about that. And so I wanted to do a separate lesson for the introduction to set that context so that as we go through this letter, that those rebuttals, if you will, to early Gnostic teaching make sense. So with that, we're going to close out this first lesson of our new series, and I hope that you will continue to join us week after week as we go through God's Word together. Thanks for joining us for another episode of the Deep in the Bible podcast. A reminder to please subscribe and give this video a thumbs up down below on YouTube. Also remember to follow us on your preferred podcasting platform. Visit our website at deepinthebible.com to download study guides for our lessons, and follow us on our socials. We are at Deep in the Bible, no spaces, on both Instagram and Facebook. And finally, please share our podcast with your friends, family, and church groups so we can reach as many people as possible with deep study from the Word of God. A big thanks to Sara Agee, who composed our theme music. We look forward to being back with you very soon. Until then, I am Timothy Agee, and this is the Deep in the Bible podcast.